I'm delighted to be joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Stuart.
Mr. Trump says he'll be talking with Vladimir Putin this week and hopes a ceasefire could begin immediately. Would his admiration perhaps for Putin survive if Putin rejects that ceasefire idea?
Well, that's a huge question, Stuart, but to answer that, you have to go to multiple levels because you're not just talking about Trump, you're talking about the Trump administration. And by that I mean that Vladimir Putin, and we're almost certain the Russians are sending out the signals that they will not accept this ceasefire deal. They have not officially said that yet, but they've put it out to Russian media that they think this is unacceptable. But when Putin tells specifically the envoy, Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, this probably on Friday in Moscow, he'll couch it in terms which are very flattering to Trump, that Trump, of course, is the man who can bring peace. He's the man who is a great leader. And he will couch it in terms where he says, we're not rejecting peace. Russia's not rejecting this. We just don't think this is the way forward for the settlement. And Putin has done this with Trump for years. Perhaps the most notable incident is that soon after Trump became president, in 2017, Putin, on the sidelines of a G20 meeting in Germany, pulled him aside and talked to him for a half hour with no officials present, only interpreters. And he gave him like this whole lesson on why Ukraine is really Russian territory. You know, and even though he's not going to be doing this directly to Trump, he's going to be doing it to Witkoff, he's going to put out those lines. And of course, what Putin will always dangle at the end of this is the photo opportunity. You know, that Trump will always, he'll get this meeting he's always wanted with Putin, and it'll be a celebration, etc. And again, to talk to you about the personal nature of Trump and how he operates, before he became president in 2013, when Trump was trying to get business deals in Russia, he owned the Miss Universe pageant. And he went to Moscow, took the pageant there, and he got there the night before, and he was there meeting with Russian businessmen who might be investors or might even lead this Trump project. But he really wanted to see Putin. And he was told that Putin would come see him. And Putin, at the end of the day, sent a message, I can't come. And Trump was absolutely crushed by it. But then Putin sent a really nice, elaborate Russian decorated box with a lovely letter inside it, and then Trump was won over. So Trump's had this thing for Putin for long, right? Okay. But it's not just Trump, it's Trump administration officials. What did we have all of a sudden in Saudi Arabia this week is that you had American officials going directly with Ukrainian officials. We're talking about the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and of course the folks supporting them. And when the Ukrainians could get them in that meeting room one-on-one, then you could get the pragmatic approach to this. The Ukrainians have had proposals on the table for a resolution of this since November 2022. It's a myth that they haven't been willing to negotiate. And Trump could have had this ceasefire agreement as soon as he took office on January 20th. But because of Trump playing politics, certain other advisors play politics, you had this kabuki theater for several weeks. Then you get the officials, the adults in the room, they talk to the Ukrainians. Now, what happens when Putin makes his play and rejects a ceasefire? How do those Trump officials respond to that? Do they tell Trump that the Russians are trying to play him or trying to manipulate him? Do they say, oh no, it's too risky. We need to play to Trump's ego. So if Trump comes out with a tweet and says, I don't like the deal, we have to revise it, do they follow that? And that's the uncertainty. When you can get American officials who are not playing to Trump's ego and who are not scared of what Trump might do to them, then you get some measure of diplomacy to deal with this Russian invasion. When you've got Trump officials who feel that he's watching them or that he could take retribution on him, then they have to rein themselves in or even support him, as they did when he and J.D. Vance had that beatdown of Vladimir Zelensky, which, remember, was only 12 days ago. That's how quickly these things move.
As you say, those administration members will be in Moscow. What's the risk they come back not with a positive outcome for Trump, and he feels slighted or rejected, could he do what he threatened, which was to put all of the might of the US behind Ukraine to win the war?
Again, let's talk specifically in terms of who's going to Moscow, if it turns out to be Steve Witkoff, because that adds another layer of uncertainty here. Steve Witkoff is just a buddy of Trump, a buddy who is a real estate developer. Witkoff does not have a background in diplomacy, doesn't have a background in power politics. He was named, remember, Trump's envoy to the Middle East, not to Russia. Why is Witkoff there? Because when the Russians were trying to play Trump a few weeks ago to get Trump to swing towards them and away from Ukraine, they released an American teacher who had been sentenced to 14 years there. It was Witkoff who went to Moscow to be part of the arrangements of that release. So the Kremlin were playing Witkoff at that point. Now, do they try to play Witkoff at this point? It's different than if it's Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who's there, or Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor. So there's that area. But let's say that the Kremlin flat out send Witkoff home with nothing, absolutely nothing. Trump, I don't think, goes all in for Ukraine because of two reasons. One is, I think Trump will still want to leave the door open, that Putin will still want him back. But secondly, Trump has based a lot of what he's talking about on this, three reasons. I'll add the third. I just thought of the third. Second reason, Trump's got the myth that he's the guy that can end the conflict. Now, it is a myth, and we need to emphasize it's a myth, but that means he's not going to give full aid to Ukraine, for example, for attacks on Russia. And I don't think he'll step up the sanctions on Russia either, although that could happen. The third reason why I don't think Trump gives all out support to Ukraine is he associates support of Ukraine with the Biden administration. And of course, anything the Biden administration does is going to be despicable and awful and terrible, as we saw when J.D. Vance launched that attack on Vladimir Zelensky. So no, I think what happens here is that if Russia does not play to Trump, doesn't give them a way out, it's not that Trump responds by going all out in back of Ukraine, but it gives those advisors more space who are saying, we have restored intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Let's make sure that that happens. We have restored military aid to Ukraine. Let's make sure that aid gets there. And, okay, Ukraine is going to carry out attacks on Russian installations in Russian-occupied territory and inside Russia. We're okay with that.
So even as Ukraine and the United States were discussing that proposal yesterday, European nations were furiously discussing what a peacekeeping force could look like that would give Ukraine those security guarantees in the event of a ceasefire. How will those European and other countries, there are 20 or 30 countries, be looking at this proposal agreed between Ukraine and the US?
Okay, well, this is where the rubber hits the road, because you can connect what the Ukraine and US have done with the European proposal with Russia's reaction. First of all, the Ukraine-US proposal, although it's between those two delegations, was worked out with the Europeans before the Ukrainians went to Saudi Arabia. You can go back a couple of weeks ago before things went pear-shaped, which is Emmanuel Macron's visit to the White House, Keir Starmer in the White House, Zelensky. What the Europeans were working out with Ukraine was a security guarantee. European forces, British and French, possibly other countries, in the western part of Ukraine to guard installations, including drone manufacturing plants, to guard energy infrastructure, and to bolster air defenses. The Americans were needed not to put troops in Ukraine, but the Americans were needed for air cover for those troops so the Russians don't take a pop at them. That was jeopardized by the bust-up between Trump and Zelensky. Now Ukraine and the U.S. have a working deal for a ceasefire. If the Russians do not agree to the ceasefire, then the space opens up where the Ukrainians and the Europeans go to the Americans and say, give us that guarantee, which is those airplanes based in Poland and in Romania to protect people if we put them into the west of the country. Up to this point, the Trump administration has been putting this really ridiculous myth out that somehow if you've got guys who go out and almost like with picks and axes dig out rare earth minerals, they are the security guarantee. They're not, right? So The Kremlin here is going to have to play this not only in terms of how they are playing off versus the Americans, they've got to do this in terms of playing off versus the Europeans as well. Because what they had succeeded in doing was splitting the Trump people away from the Europeans. Now the possibility that we do have a genuine partnership, again, between Trump's adults in the room and the Europeans, that has been revived.
Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, is heading to Washington this week to meet with Trump to talk about that partnership, the American commitment to NATO. How shaken is Europe's faith in the US just now?
I would say this from a pragmatic point of view, because I don't think anyone really has faith in the Trump administration. But what you have is a pragmatic relationship, which is the kind of relationship you've had largely since World War II, which is we work with each other. We have institutions with which work with each other. Even if the president, was a bit wobbly, you had militaries that worked with each other, intelligence services that worked with each other, financial departments that worked with each other, diplomats that worked with each other. What Europe woke up to, actually they knew this would happen. It wasn't quite waking up. What was coming to be fulfilled was that you no longer had U.S. institutions that you could count on as partners, because the guy at the top was so unpredictable, so vindictive at certain points, that you could not do business as usual. And that was the point that we were at after that infamous White House meeting. And if you remember what happened, the chain of this, to answer your question by giving that recent background, Zelensky gets done over on February 28th. By March the 2nd, which is the Monday after that meeting, the Monday after the Friday, the Europeans come out, emergency meeting in Brussels, talk about the security guarantee, talk about assistance for Ukraine, talk about an alternative political path to the US-Russia talks. By the end of that week, they've got the possibility of opening up public and private capital for up to 800 billion euros in military aid. They've got the working plan for security guarantees we're talking about, and they've got that idea of where they go to the Americans and say, well, if you want to talk to the Russians, we've got an alternative way of doing this. Why not consider this? And all of those things have been in play. The Europeans, in other words, it wasn't just a case of waking up, it was a question of recognizing what was happening and being able to plan effectively for it. I'm not always give praise to the European Union or to European institutions. They can move quite slowly. They can be at times a bit awkward in how they tried to bring this about. But in the last few weeks, I think credit goes across the EU and across European leaders, including Emmanuel Macron in France, including Keir Starmer in the UK, including Ursula von der Leyen at the EU. They stepped up, which was exactly what was needed.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Stuart.